Hey students, what's up? This is your Soc 204 lecture on paradigms. Paradigms are a very important conversation to have early in the class because it is going to be a reoccurring theme how we relate things to the three dominant sociological paradigms. So what do we mean when we say paradigms? Paradigms are just a fancy way of saying a worldview, a way of organizing how the world works. And we have lots of paradigms. We have a liberal paradigm. We have a conservative paradigm. So if you're liberal or conservative, you might not know the specific liberal or conservative position on something like, say, genetically modified organisms, but you can probably figure it out. Liberals care about science and they care about protecting people, so you could probably guess that a liberal position would be critical of genetically modified organisms. Say it. The conservative perspective is all about money, and who has the most money at the end wins. And so, since this is a way to make money for corporations by genetically modifying organisms to make more product, to sell more food, that the conservatives might be very pro GMOs. That's a broad generalization. There are some liberals that are pro GMOs because they help feed people who haven't been fed, including the hungry people of the world. And there are some conservatives that are anti GMO because they cut into small family farms, for example. So these are broad generalizations, but we can also talk about religious paradigms. You have Christian paradigms and Muslim paradigms and Jewish paradigms and Buddhist paradigms. I say that because I'm just coming from my Buddhism class, and they have certain ways of looking at the world. We also have, as we've already talked about, a sociological paradigm. This idea of tabula rasa, blank slate, you're the product of your environment. Strange and the familiar, the connection of the micro and the macro are all part of the sociological paradigm. This idea that we are on the side of nurture versus nature when it comes to the great debate about how we be. But what we're going to talk about today are the three dominant sociological paradigms under the sociological paradigm. And those are the functionalist paradigm, the conflict paradigm, and the symbolic interactionist paradigm. We're going to talk about how each of those is unique, some of the people associated with it, and then we're going to try a little exercise of applying those paradigms, because we're going to be doing this all throughout the quarter, including applying it to the book that we're reading this term. Okay, so let's go in sort of chronological order and talk about, I'm very casual now, talk about the functionalist paradigm. The functionalist paradigm has a very specific way of looking at the world. It sees society as an organism. It's a very organic view of the world. So think of the model that you have from your high school anatomy class of the cell, right? You've got the cell diagram. We've got the membrane. We've got the nucleus. We've got the endoplasmic reticulum. We've got the mitochondria. All that important stuff that you learned in 10th grade about the cell. The idea in the cell is that everything is there because it performs a function. I mean, don't ask me what the endoplasmic reticulum does. I assume it keeps the ghost away. But that everything in the cell is there because it performs a function. Nothing is just hanging out in a cell. It's there because it has a job to do. So like the cell, society is an organism from the functionalist perspective, and everything in society has a function. So for example, the family. We see a version of the family, we call it a cultural universal. Some version of the family in all cultures. It's there because it performs a function, right? We just can't have babies and set them on the ground and send them on their way and say, go be a human being. We have to train them how to be in the world. The family is very functional. We'll talk about religion. Religion can be very functional in a society. Religion can provide people with values and an understanding of how the world works. It can be functional. Things are in society from a functionalist perspective. And the first question we always ask is, what is the function of this thing? What is the function of the media? What is the function of the trailblazers? What is the function of political parties? Like anything that's in a society must be there because somehow it is functional to the functioning of the organism. Just like the mitochondrial DNA is functional, so is this idea of a two-party democratic system. Somehow it's functional. But things can also be dysfunctional, right? Things can be functional, but also they may cause harm. So when we look at the organism, there are things in the body that can be helpful. Bacteria is very functional in breaking down the stuff in our body as we eat it. We need all that bacteria in our gut to break all the food down and turn it into nutrients. But that bacteria can also be dysfunctional and get us very sick. So things in society can be both functional and dysfunctional. They can also cause harm. And this is a really important part of the functionalist perspective, which is this idea of slow change. Slow change happens through this concept, and you know this concept, evolution. Slow evolution. So think about how the biological organism adapts, right? This is the science of Charles Darwin when he looked at biological organisms in a context of the environment that we're in and how they adapted to the environment. This is where he comes up with his theory of the evolution of the species by doing empirical research there on the Galapagos Islands, that things slowly evolve. I mean, human beings as a biological entity are billions of years of evolution from, tiny little plasmas to these complex creatures that you see when you look in the mirror. And part of that is stuff that is from the old days. The appendix is a holdover from a diet that we had 100,000 years ago, and it's no longer functional. In fact, it can be so dysfunctional that it can kill you. Human beings have tailbones, right? That is a remnant of an earlier version of us when we were hanging out in trees and had tails. So there is this slow adaptation. So the model here from the functionalist perspective is that when things are functional, they're very important to the organism. But when they're dysfunctional or no longer functional, they start to evolve out. And the example I always like to give for the people that remember the 20th century is this ancient concept of the travel agent. The travel agent. Used to be if you wanted to take a trip, there was a functioning thing in the organism of society called the travel agent. You would go into the travel office and you'd say, hey, I want to spend my summer in Rome. Can you A, book a trip, B, find me a hotel, and C, give me 5 things that I should do while I'm in Rome. And the travel agent, who would be an expert in that, would plan your trip out. Very functional. Nobody goes to the travel agent anymore. Why? Because the internet has made it dysfunctional. It's now just easy to go onto Expedia and boom, 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 I've booked a trip. I mean, I do it all the time. I plan trips, around the world from my phone. I had to get out of, when I was in Ukraine, I was stuck in Warsaw, and I'm like, I gotta get out of here. I gotta get back and teach. Pulled out my phone, boom, 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 boom. Booked a series of flights. I went like this. I went to Krakow, Warsaw, Amsterdam, Newark, New Jersey, San Francisco to Seattle to Portland. Not super functional, but I did it all on my phone. I didn't need a travel agent. So the travel agent has emerged, has gone out. So when we're looking at things from a sociological perspective and being functionalist, we're asking, is it functional? Is it dysfunctional? Because, and here's how this works, if the dysfunctions of something start to outweigh the functions, then it starts to evolve out, kind of like our tailbone. It starts to move out of the system. It's no longer functional. So, we can talk about things that the internet has replaced, like the yellow pages. Like, people don't even know what the yellow pages are anymore. It used to be incredibly functional. You want to know anything, you looked at the yellow pages. Nobody does that anymore. It has evolved out of the organism because it's no longer functional. So we're going to circle back at the end and do a real specific example of how this is. So functionalists always look at the function. Now, one of the main functionalist thinkers is this guy, Emil Durkheim. Emil Durkheim, who you hear more about in the next section when we talk about social theory. Durkheim is kind of the father, not really the father of functionalism, that would be Herbert Spencer, but kind of the most famous early functionalist is Emil Durkheim. And Durkheim was very interested in how things are functional. In fact, in class, we'll talk about religion and whether that's functional or dysfunctional. The one of the things that's very interesting that Durkheim talked about is crime. That crime can be a sign of a dysfunctional society. Like we have a breakdown in the organism. The family isn't doing its job. We aren't raising children properly, or people aren't going to church enough. The church isn't doing its job. That there's a breakdown of the organism. But he argued that crime is pretty much a constant part of human society. Since the beginning of recorded time, since Hammurabi's Code, an eye for an eye, we've had people committing what have been defined as crimes. So in that sense, yeah, it could be a part of a dysfunctional society, but it could also be functional. The crime could be functional. Why is crime functional? For a couple of reasons. It shows us what our values are. When somebody commits a crime, we have a conversation and say, oh, we don't do that in our society. That's against our values. So it's sort of clarifying about what we care about as a society. It can bring people together. Right? When something horrible happens, I remember this after 9/11, that, it really brought Americans together. This horrible crime that happened really brought Americans together. But also, it can help the evolution. It can help the evolution because we have a conversation about it and we're like, do we really want to still define this as a crime? So a perfect example of that would be Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a criminal. Right? She broke the law of segregation in Alabama by being a black woman and sitting on the front of the bus. She broke the law. She went to jail. But her breaking the law was functional because America was forced into a conversation about, do we want to have these laws? Do we want to have these laws that tell black people that they have to sit on the back of the boat? The bus, not the boat. Maybe the boat also. So we got to have a conversation that allowed for the evolution of law. And now what was the crime, violating segregation law, is now the opposite, right? It's now against the law to racially discriminate. And I think one of the things that's happening in America right now with all these ICE raids is that we are having a conversation. Hey, is this really how we want to do it in America? These people are not criminals. Being an undocumented immigrant is a civil violation. It's not a felony, or not even a misdemeanor. Do we want to treat these people like they're mass murderers because of paperwork? So we're having a national conversation, and Durkheim would say that all those people who are undocumented are helping us to evolve as a society. Let's hope we go in the right direction. So from the functionalist perspective, let's just keep that in mind. We look at things from, do they function for the good of society, and how do they function? Or is there dysfunction? Right, we're going to come back to that in a minute. Second is the conflict paradigm. The conflict paradigm is super simple. The conflict paradigm is about power dynamics. It's not about conflict. It's not about like my baseball team versus your baseball team, or my political view versus your political view. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about power dynamics. Anytime that you're looking at something from the conflict perspective, you should have this box. I'll put a picture up of a power dynamic of the haves and the have-nots, that one group has power and another group doesn't have power. All right. The conflict paradigm right there. So there are classic versions of this. The most classic comes from our friend Karl Marx, who you'll also hear more about this week. Karl Marx looked at economic power between what he called the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the owners of the factories and the people who worked in the factories. We would think in more broad terms about the rich and the rest of us, the billionaire class that controls so much of what's happening in Washington, D.C. these days, and the rest of us who are just paying rent to those people. Like there's an economic power dynamic. But that's not the only one. Marx is famous for that, and that's why Marx is so easy, because he's a one-trick pony. He's an economic determinist. Everything is about money. But there are other power dynamics, including one of the big ones we're going to talk about in this class is the gender power dynamic. Despite you've come a long way, baby, we still live in a power dynamic called patriarchy, where men have immense advantage. They have advantage in terms of economics. They make more money for the exact same work. They have power in terms of culture. That the norm is we start with the male and then we assume the female. They have power in terms of their safety. that women know, just by virtue of being female, you are at risk in the society of violence in a way that men are not. We'll get into this. So every woman understands exactly what I'm talking about. There are lots of guys who are like, Oprah. That there is a power dynamic based on gender that we call patriarchy. There's a power dynamic based on race. Despite the progress that we've made, we live in a white supremacist society, as evidenced by, a political administration that targets brown people on a regular basis in a way that it doesn't target white people. There is an incredible amount of built-in racism in our society. It's in the criminal justice system, it's in the education system, it's in the healthcare system, it's in the entertainment system, it's in the banking system. Racism is woven into every facet of our society. So that's a power dynamic. Okay. So here, when you have a power dynamic, there are some terms that are sort of flipped when we're talking about these paradigms. One of the important concepts from the functionalist perspective is this idea of consensus, that the organism exists because the people generally agree that this is the most functional system that we've got. It's completely different from the conflict perspective. The dominating idea is this idea of status quo, that the people in power want to maintain their position of power, whether it's the rich people or the white people or the male people or the cis people or the hetero people. Whatever the category is, it's good to be the king and you don't want to give up power. So your goal is to maintain the status quo. You want to keep people fighting amongst each other so they don't bother you at the top. I mean, that's why this whole thing on the bottom of people getting upset about trans athletes or immigrants or drag queens or whatever, it's good for the people on the top, because as long as the people on the bottom are fighting each other over these silly things, they leave the people on the top alone. The status quo is maintained. So if the status quo is maintained, change here is going to be very different. So from the functionalist perspective, change is slow and evolutionary. It just sort of adapts to the environment, and things sort of like travel agents kind of ease out of the system and are replaced by Expedia, and it's just this slow evolution of a functioning organism. Here, since the change has to come from the bottom, right? So people at the bottom, they're like, yeah, no, we're not going to do this anymore. Since it's the people at the bottom, the change here is fast and revolutionary. Instead of slow and evolutionary, fast and revolutionary. It doesn't necessarily mean violent. It just means challenging the status quo. So this is the labor union movement. This is the civil rights movement. This is the feminist movement. This is the gay rights movement. This is the disability rights movement. This is the trans movement. This is the immigrant rights movement. All these things come from the bottom, challenging the people that have power. So it's really important from the conflict perspective for the people on the bottom to be able to see that power dynamic, so they can then challenge it. And this is Karl Marx writing the first line in the Communist Manifesto: "Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." So the change comes from on the bottom. And this is one when we're looking at religion, when we're looking at the media, when we're looking at politics, how is the status quo maintained and how is it being challenged by people at the bottom? I mean, I think 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement was an incredible challenge to the status quo. I mean, what is more of a power dynamic than racial policing? Policing that overwhelmingly targets young black bodies, including with deadly force, right? That was a challenge to that. Enough is enough. Right? We're going to challenge the status quo, and we're going to push back against the power dynamic. Okay, so that's that analysis. That's that paradigm. The third paradigm is a lot different. It's called the symbolic interactionist paradigm. And the third paradigm is much more micro. Functionalist is a macro level paradigm. Society is an organism. We're going to look at it as a whole, with functioning parts like religion and the family and the media and politics. Conflict is a macro level paradigm. Society is a power dynamic between the haves and have-nots. The rich people, the billionaire class, the Elon Musk of the world, and those of us that are just, paying the basics to stay alive in society. That's a macro level picture. Symbolic interactionism is much more micro. Symbolic interactionism looks at the individual and the influences around them. So instead of having a big picture of society, we've got a little stick figure with these sort of things that influence around them. The symbolic interactionist paradigm. And the key concept here from the symbolic interactionist perspective is this idea of shared understanding. Shared understanding. What is the shared understanding we have of things? So the example I always love to use of a symbolic interactionist perspective is the idea of the speed limit. That if the speed limit is 55, right, that's the law, but we have a shared understanding of what that really means, right? Wink, wink, wink. That if it's 55, you can get away with going 65. How do you know that? Like, it's not written on the sign, 65 but wink, wink, or 55 but wink, wink, you can go 65. Right? We develop that through the interaction with others, with riding in the car with family members and friends and paying attention to other cars around us. We start to notice, oh, hey, wait a second. If I'm going 55 into 55, people are going to honk at me for going too slow. We develop this shared understanding on a micro level. And this concept we've already talked about because this is the core idea of the social construction of reality. The social construction of reality from Berger and Luckman, remember those two from last week? That's the idea that we develop a shared understanding. We develop a shared understanding of what's beautiful in a society. We develop a shared understanding of what's cool in a society. We develop a shared understanding of what God looks like in a society. Through our interaction on varying levels, we develop these shared understandings, and that's how society works. Now, where this becomes problematic is when we don't have a shared understanding, when there's a lack of a shared understanding. So one of my favorite symbolic interactionist phrases is, are we on the same page? Are we on the same page here? That's sort of the implication that we have a shared understanding of meaning. Around certain issues, we do. Like the value of privacy. We have a shared understanding that that's pretty important in our society. But there's lots of things we don't. Perfect example of where we don't have a shared understanding is around the idea of gender. Right? Whenever anybody says there's only two genders, I'm like, yeah, no, you're completely wrong because you're confusing biological sex with sociological gender. They're two different ideas. If you want to make the case that there are two biological sexes, go for it. But when we're talking about gender, that's a whole different subject. We are not on the same page. Just think about the idea of freedom. We are not on the same page in America about what freedom means. Does freedom mean the freedom to own a gun? Or the freedom to have, for women to have reproductive control over their own bodies and decide if they want to carry a pregnancy or not carry a pregnancy. There's no freedom there. That freedom has been taken away from women in this country. So we are not on the same page. We have a problem because we don't have a shared understanding around that thing. And so we're looking on a much more micro level. And so I always think that this is a great example or a great way to explain why comedy works. The reason comedy works is we have a shared understanding about what makes it funny, like what the punchline to the joke is. Anytime you see a good comedian, and I should probably drop a little clip of a comedian.
Mismo, and yes, I am from Finland. Woohoo! Yay! 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 It's so great to be here. I speak English now. I didn't grow up speaking English. I had to learn it later, and it's not easy. It's so hard. I've been speaking English for years, but I still have to look up words every day. I learn new words all the time, and I recently learned this word, and it's my favorite word now. I had no idea about this word until recently, and I love it. You must know this. The meaning of the word, the meaning is that you have now poured enough coffee into my cup. And it goes like I didn't know about that.
Telling a joke. We know why it's funny because we're on the same page of the double meaning. I mean, my daughter's first joke that she ever told when she was like 3 was, what does a ghost panda bear eat? Bamboo. Brilliant. Brilliant joke for a 3-year-old to tell because she knew that there were two meanings, right? That pandas eat bamboo and boo is something a ghost would say. Brilliant. Brilliant. That is my kid. She's very smart. So comedy is funny because we understand, oh, right. That's why that's important or why that's a little edgy or why that. I mean, I love the complexity of language, and I think people who are learning English know that these way we the way we use language is a complex thing. You got to have a shared understanding. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day, is that when you could say something, man, that person really put me in a mood, right? You know what that means, right? They put me in a mood. They upset me. But if I say that person put me in a mood, it's different than saying that person put me in the mood. That person put me in the mood. Woo. Right? There's something else going on there. If they put you in a mood, they upset you. If they put you in the mood, they turned you on. Yeah. So, one of the things I see with my students that is a really good example of this is a lot of students, especially students who are not native English speakers, will talk about when we're talking about race, we'll talk about colored people. We'll talk about colored people. And I have to say, no. It's people of color. But if you're just learning English, people of color and colored people, it's basically the same thing, right? You're saying the same thing. But if you've lived in America, there's a shared understanding that colored people is racist because it's a term that was used in the Jim Crow South. And we don't use that term anymore. That's from the 1950s. And if you say colored people, you're going to sound very racist. People of color, even though grammatically it's the same thing, has a completely different shared understanding. So please make a note of this, because I'm tired of telling students to stop saying colored people. It's okay. Doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you haven't developed a shared understanding. Okay, so those are our three paradigms. Two of them are very macro, one of them is very micro. So what we'll be doing this term, and we're going to do it in class as well, is applying these three paradigms. This book that we're reading this term, how would it be viewed from a conflict perspective? How would it be viewed from a functionalist perspective? What would symbolic interactionist look at in this book that we're reading? I want to give you a specific example to apply all three of these things, because we're going to do this a lot this term. Okay, if you live in Portland, you may have seen a bumper sticker that says MLB and PDX. MLB and PDX. Now, if you have the shared understanding, you know exactly what that means, MLB and PDX. You might not. I'm going to let you think about it for a second. Those of you that are older certainly know that MLB stands for Major League Baseball, and PDX is the code for Portland. So MLB and PDX is about the effort to bring Major League Baseball to Portland, Oregon. Someone who's from Atlanta, GA, the home of the Braves, yes, please, let's bring baseball to Portland. But let's look at it from the three paradigms. What would these three paradigms have to say about this concept of MLB and PDX? Okay, so the functionalists, and we'll just do this quickly. The functionalists would say, okay, well, we have a question. Would it be functional? How would it be functional for the city of Portland? And they can make a list, right? It would bring a lot of money to the city. It would bring some recognition to the city. It would employ a whole bunch of people in the city. It would help develop a section of the city. I mean, they're trying to figure out where they would do it. Would they do it on the South Waterfront? There is a plan to build it where the Lloyd Center is now in Northeast Portland, which is my neighborhood, which I love. I could just crawl to the baseball games. So there would be economic development. There would be urban development. It would be incredibly functional in a lot of ways. I mean, just all the people that would hire, including the people selling the hot dogs. Although it's Portland, so they would be selling beyond belief burgers or something. I love going to games in Seattle because instead of like cheese dogs, you get sushi and microbrew. So it would be incredibly functional. It would also be a little bit dysfunctional, right? Because you're going to have to displace a whole bunch of people to build a stadium. Those areas may be gentrified, so you may create higher rents in the city where the rents are already really high, so you may push more people into poverty and homelessness. If you've ever been around the Moda Center when there's a Blazak game, you know the traffic is horrible. So this may add to the the traffic problems of Portland. There is a concern that Major League Sports gets people drinking and fighting, and so there may be violence, and if we win or we lose, people may set things on fire. So what the functionalists are doing right now is weighing the positive functions, all the stuff that would bring to the city, and the dysfunctions, all the problems that would cause the city, and trying to figure out if it would be more functional than dysfunctional. That's the functionalist perspective. The conflict perspective are kind of coming at it from a whole different angle, right? They're looking for power dynamics. Where are the power dynamics? First of all, there's economic power dynamics. I mean, these teams are owned by multi-billionaires who make a whole bunch of money, and there are people who are, parking the cars who are making sub-minimum wage, right? So there's an economic power dynamic. There's a racial power dynamic as well, is that these teams are overwhelmingly owned by white people, and what they'll do is they'll go to, the Dominican Republic and find some poor kid playing on a baseball diamond and say, hey, we'll recruit you to play for the Portland team. I don't know what the Portland team would be called, the Baristas, perhaps. We're going to recruit you for the Portland team, and you play, and we'll pay you six figures. And then when you tear your ACL, you're going back to the Dominican Republic because we got another person that we can find. I mean, it's literally a plantation system where we find poor people, often from minority backgrounds, especially Hispanic backgrounds these days, bring them on, exploit the hell out of them, make a ton of money off of them, and then throw them back on the junk heap from where they came from. Once they're used up. So there's a power dynamic there based on race. There's also a huge gender power dynamic. Where are the female players? Where are the female owners? I mean, this is a male-dominated sport. I mean, one of the things about soccer is at least there's a kick-ass women's team. I mean, we've been taking my daughter to see the Thorns game, and it was like a year into it when she said, Dad, do you know that there's a team for boys too? I'm like, yeah, they're called the Timbers. There was some gender parity there in soccer that is just not there in baseball. There's just so few female voices present in Major League Baseball. Occasionally, in the sports casting of it or the journalist, but for the most part, it's all boys all the time, the boys of summer. So there's a power dynamic there to look at. And the economic one is really interesting because I'm old enough to remember when the players went on strike, when they were so tired of this plantation system where they couldn't really represent themselves and have power over their own careers, that they all went on strike and said, we're going to have a revolutionary change in the system if we're going to continue to make money for the owners of this game. So there's a real power dynamic there. The third one, and again, these are very brief analyses, is the symbolic interactionist perspective. They're going to look at it on a micro level. And then on the micro level, it's a very interesting question because the question is, where is the shared understanding that baseball even matters? Like we used to say, mom, apple pie, and baseball. America has changed, and Portland certainly has changed. Portland is not sort of the old school mom, apple pie, and baseball. It's more like Abuelita, falafel, and Major League Soccer. There's more of a consensus that soccer matters. In fact, among younger people, soccer is the sport. Even in Atlanta, which has a baseball team, a football team, a basketball team, and I think still has a hockey team, the soccer games are a bigger draw. The young people do not care about baseball. They are just not that it's old white guys like me that are like, please bring baseball to Portland. Young people don't care about it. That there isn't a shared understanding in the city of Portland that baseball is worth the effort. People are into other things. If we had like a national gaming tournament of watching people play video games or something, young people might actually be excited about that, but they're not excited about baseball. So from that perspective, it ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. So each of those is analysis. A functionalist, is baseball functional or dysfunctional for Portland? Conflict, what are the power dynamics, and do we want to have that type of exploitation here in Portland? Right? Maybe if we had a women's baseball team, there might be some movement. And from the symbolic interactionist perspective, is there a shared understanding that it matters? So that's just a little example of how we'll be going through these three paradigms. So we're going to be doing this a whole bunch. So I want you to feel comfortable. We'll do some of this in class as well. I want you to feel comfortable with each of these paradigms because I might ask you, hey, Joe, what's the functionalist analysis here? Hey, Cindy Lou, what would conflict theorists be looking for in this situation? Hey, Bettina Rose, what would symbolic interactionists think about this? Those are my three randomly selected students. Okay, cool. All right, so next we're going to get into a section about some of the classic theorists that help move these paradigms forward. But I wanted to give you that as a starting discussion on paradigms. Right on. Okay. There we go. All right, hang out, and we'll have another lecture video up shortly. Thank you.